Hi, everyone. This is Seth Maskett. Thank you so much for joining in today. And I am honored today to be joined by Brian Beutler. Brian is the author of the excellent Substack newsletter Off Message. He's formerly of Crooked Media and The New Republic, among several other publications. Brian and I actually met several years ago at elections conference at UC Berkeley, where we learned A, that we were both alumni, and B, that we had a soft spot for top dog, or hot dogs. Um, Brian, if I may ask you, what is your go-to? What is your preference on hot dogs there?
I used to get the linguiça a lot, which is sort of like a
Ooh,
spicy
okay.
Portuguese sausage. But I can't remember the menu because I graduated so goddamn long
Yeah,
ago.
and they changed it a little bit too, but yeah.
Yeah, I did go while I was there for that conference just to, check it off the box. But I couldn't. I forget if the original location on Durant Street was closed or something because the one
Uh,
that I had to go to was down on University, like south of campus. Or yeah, whatever. Anyway, west of campus. And it
okay,
was it was like way too new and modern and not nearly grubby enough.
that's a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Me personally, I generally went with the New York, occasionally the Polish, lots of sauerkraut and brown mustard. Um, okay. So, Brian, you and I both wrote pieces recently on conspiracy theories that have emerged in the wake of several assassination attempts on Donald Trump. For the most part, I find these conspiracy theories kind of annoying, kind of nonsensical. But I think you had a particularly novel take on this. You wrote something that while Trump didn't bring the shootings on himself, he did bring the conspiracy theories on himself. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be careful how I put this because I also think in addition to fostering a climate in which people don't know what to believe and expect the worst or expect him to be engaged in chicanery kind of all the time, he also created a climate where people feel very oppressed. And in a climate like that, in a country that's very large and very armed, I think it stands to reason that that kind of conduct would increase the incidence of political violence almost mechanically. And so, like, I don't want to victim blame somebody who's been on the receiving end of multiple assassination attempts, but he should look in the mirror, and obviously so should all the people who rush to his defense to pretend that this is some sort of epidemic of left wing violence. But the main point of that piece was less about how much does Trump deserve blame for these acts of violence, the ones that have been directed at him and others, and more about why, particularly post Butler, Pennsylvania shooting, and then post the White House Correspondents' Dinner attempted shooting, that many people on the right, but more on the left now, have sort of started to wonder whether these were false flag incidents, whether these were set up, whether like maybe Trump was sort of behind it. He orchestrated an attempted shooting in Butler, Pennsylvania, to help his campaign, or he did it again just the other week at the White House Correspondents Association to improve his poll numbers, which are flagging for all kinds of reasons. And I wrote the piece to say that the conspiracy theories don't make sense. I feel similarly to them as it sounds like you do. But that the people who are now becoming inclined to believe them, it's hard to blame them, right? Because Trump is the sort of person whose character is so low that he would do something like that. If he thought he could get away with it, he would try. Or if he found out that like a foreign power was going to orchestrate a fake assassination attempt against him to help him because they wanted him to be president, which is sort of like what just happened in Hungary. And he found out about it. It's not like he would say the national security interests of the United States require me to interrupt this effort to meddle in our politics and blah, blah, blah. He would lean into it. He would be happy that people from the outside were scheming in a way to advance his political fortunes. And, he schemed to try to get Vladimir Zelensky to make up lies about Joe Biden ahead of the 2020 election. He schemed to get Russian help in the 2016 election. And so, of course, people who have been opposed to him all along, or people who are becoming opposed to him now, see his character, see that he is the sort of person who will do this sort of thing. And so naturally they start to wonder, is this real? And every time there's an information gap, right? Like, why haven't we heard anything from the doctors who treated him in Butler? Like, why didn't he free them to talk? Why didn't this or that? They say, well, that's just evidence of the conspiracy theory, or that makes me think that there's something fishy here, more than some of these people would have suspected in prior presidencies. And so the purpose was just to sort of say, I don't think you're right about the conspiracy theory, but I get why you feel like this is all very weird and like it's worth wondering whether there's more at play here.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's, to some extent, I found it useful to as a piece of evidence that conspiratorial thinking is not just the domain of one party, right? I've heard definitely a lot from folks on the left over the years saying, "Why are Republicans so stupid, believing in QAnon or something like that, or believing nefarious things about Biden or the Obamas?" Um, this is, there's lots of people who are prone to conspiratorial thinking in various circumstances. It's not just people on one side of the aisle. I think one of the big differences, though, is that generally presidents don't echo those, right? Presidents aren't trying to advance conspiracy theories the way Donald Trump has. And so it's not, whatever you feel is like being reinforced that way by, figures you respect. And also, like, most presidents don't traffic in threats of political violence the way he does. So, like, there is a lot of stuff that's unique about this moment.
I mean, I think I could construct a case. I'm not sure I would want to, but I'm certain I could construct a case that reaching a hand of understanding out to people who are indulging conspiracy theories about these Trump shooting incidents might actually be salutary for the country, because it would tend to re-equilibrate how many conspiracy theories exist among people who vote for Democrats and how many exist among people who vote for Republicans. Because my sense of what's happened over the years is that, when I was first paying attention to politics, which is essentially like late Clinton years on, the conspiracy theorists were fairly evenly distributed across parties. For different conspiracy theories appeal to different kinds of people, but you could find conspiracy theorists with weird crankish left-wing beliefs and conspiracy theories with weird crankish right-wing beliefs, and they more or less canceled each other out when it came time to vote. And then in 2004, John Kerry loses. You get a bunch of left-wing conspiracy theories about the Diebold equipment and Halliburton and all the reasons why maybe John Kerry secretly won that election. And people still kind of recall those conspiracy theories today to kind of justify what Trump does when he denies the results of elections. But then I think from there, two things happen. One is that in the late Bush, early Obama eras, Democrats got drew a lot of political power from pointing out that a lot of the failures from the Bush administration stemmed from their rejection of science, their rejection of empiricism, their desire to kind of create a postmodern basis for politics in which sort of what they say goes as opposed to what's true goes. And I think this worked for them as amid the wreckage of the Bush administration, people were eager for a party that was identifying itself as people who'd follow the experts, follow the science. And I think that tended to make Democrats a little bit less prone to conspiratorial thinking and Republicans maybe a little bit more so. And then Donald Trump becomes president and he fully embraces conspiracy theories. And that fully reorients the policy. Like there was like a full political realignment of cranks in the Republican Party and like anti-crankish people into the Democratic Party. And here's where like the point about maybe it would be salutary to lure some of those people back is that if let's say a quarter of the country is prone to conspiratorial thinking and they all exist in the right-wing party, then that party is going to be very inclined to fascism. And it's going to win in a system like ours half the time or a third of the time or something like that. That's really dangerous. I mean, that's what we're living through right now in some sense. And so that maybe things were on a more even keel when people who had conspiratorial tendencies, didn't think that Democrats were always judging them and like always there to scold them for, not believing the experts and so on. And that like maybe having a slightly larger heart for those people would steady American politics and bring us back to a place where there are left wing cranks and right wing cranks, but the leaders of the two parties could more or less let them cancel each other out.
Hmm. Okay, that's interesting. I like that idea that this is tied to anti-elitism or things like that. I want to actually pivot a little bit and talk
Okay.
about elites. There was a piece you wrote recently about the role of billionaires in U.S. politics, and especially like what exactly Democrats are supposed to do about them. This really seems to be a dividing line within the Democratic Party, particularly when we're talking about like tech billionaires, which swung pretty hard right in recent elections. I want to quote from what you wrote there about the nature of political billionaires today. You wrote, and I'm quoting, one faction of the billionaire class is clearly rotten and drunk with power. It has used and continues to use money and influence to advance evil, selfish ends. Other billionaires don't do this, and we could use them inside the tent, both for their resources and to assure the public that Democrats aren't anti success or anything else, anti anything else that happens to be popular. You write here, my response to that argument is maybe, but the billionaires are going to have to sort themselves. End of quote. So I think you're right that the billionaire class is creating some problems and divisiveness among Democrats we generally don't see among Republicans in the same way. I'm curious, like, what is your advice for Democrats? What should the party be doing, especially going into an election cycle where billionaire money will be very present, and in an environment where, like, you have billionaires like J.D. Pritzker and maybe others ramping up campaigns for president in 2028? I mean, just what should be happening at this time of intense plutocracy?
I guess what I think is that Democrats should decide what they believe about this new era of where you have something like billionaire culture. There are enough billionaires.
Yeah.
There's like a culture of them, and they are playing heavily in politics. To come to concrete belief and understanding about the significance of that question, and then about what should be done about it as a result, and then stick to their guns on it with the understanding that that might drive, there's a subset of billionaires that are more pro-social, that they give to um to causes that I think you and I would consider good. They, I think nobody likes to be vilified, but they tolerate a certain level of class warfare from their political allies. But that if the party were to more completely embrace a sort of political economy critique of billionaires, like not necessarily every billionaire is a policy failure, but we need to do something about the power of billionaires in this country, that might radicalize some Democratic donors out of the party. And that might reduce the amount of money the big fundraisers in Democratic politics can raise. And if that's the case, they need to be able to live with that. Be, because Well, so I guess um, eh, I think billionaire discourse is relatively new because billionaires are relatively new. My sense, and this is where I'll lean on your expertise, is that prior to the advent of like literal billionaires, um, class politics around the ultra wealthy tended to pertain to their power and influence rather than the number of dollars that they had, right? Like, you didn't hear that every centimillionaire is a policy failure, right? Before we had billionaires. But that I feel like what happened is that post Citizens United, the broad left went in mostly in one of two directions, right? You had a liberal establishment where the idea that the ruling in Citizens United was bad, and we shouldn't have unlimited anonymous corporate expenditure in politics, and that there should be transparency and good campaign finance laws and all the rest. But ultimately, the consequences of Citizens United per se were fairly modest. And that money in politics doesn't really get you that far, right? Like you could spend tons and tons and tons of money, but people come to the beliefs they want through, they aren't controlled by billionaires pulling strings. And so, all the lobbying in the world doesn't make it so that people no longer want healthcare or whatever. And that the main problem, right, with billionaires is that they're slightly undertaxed, right? We could use that money for the general welfare, to pay for healthcare, to pay for roads and bridges. And then there was like the Occupy Wall Street, Bernie Sanders view, that was almost the inverse, right? Like, obviously, they think that billionaires should pay much more in taxes, um, but that the main thing that they were concerned about was political economy, and that like, are we a government of by and for people, or are we more of like a feudal nation where the government kind of compels order from the plebes on behalf of the very wealthy, right? And I think that the Trump era has like spectacularly vindicated the people who made the latter critique.
Mm.
Even though I don't, I don't really know what every billionaire is a policy failure means. It's catchy and it kind of sounds intuitive, but it basically leaves the solutions or whatever to the imagination. But they were dead on that we were headed for this dark era of overmighty citizens capturing the government and using it to extract more wealth and power at our expense. And so where I've settled on the question, and I don't, Democrats need to come to this on their own, I guess, is that you absolutely do want to think of the billionaire class as a sink of money that that the federal government should tax for the purposes of reducing inequality and funding important projects and reducing the debt and all that stuff, but also to basically say, no, you have too much power. Like, you're buying elections now, and you're controlling the people that you pay to get into office, and that's not tolerable in a free democratic society. And so they should think of the taxing power not just as like a fiscal tool, but as a tool to ensure that that you know it's not. It's like, it's great to have one person, one vote to the extent that we have that, except if the only people we get to vote for are selected by a class of billionaires. And so they should think of it as a way to reorient how much power the government has relative to the wealthiest citizens, relative to the masses of citizens, relative to the private sector, right? And that might cause some difficulties inside the coalition. But I think the right approach is ultimately the one that like flows naturally from the analysis, right? And I'm not sure if Democrats have really given this question as much thought as they ought to have. And if they ever do, I think that they will like come around to the view that I just espoused.
That's okay. This is really interesting. And what you're saying there just reminded me of a lot of different things. I mean, you're right that this issue is a fairly new one. I mean, there's been longstanding concern about the role that wealthy people play in politics, right? And that goes back to the Gilded Age or earlier. Um, but in particular, like this new and very political, like a class of billionaires, like we're talking about like hundreds of people, um, and being fairly aligned with one party is actually pretty new, I think. I recall reading some analysis. I think it was political scientist Keith Poole a few years back. It was like a decade ago, like trying to identify the actual ideological positions of the super wealthy, the people who donate, based on their donation patterns, how right wing or left wing are the super wealthy. And it turns out they were all over the map ideologically. Some were, very, funding very right wing causes. Some were funding very left wing causes. And I think you've seen that become a much more right wing phenomenon in recent years, which I think for a number of reasons I want to ask you about that. Um, Other things that are triggering this, like I've written a little bit about the rise of progressivism, excuse me, not progressivism, populism, in both parties in recent years. So you've had this rise of the populist right within the Republican Party over the last several decades, which helped explain how this became a natural home for Trump. Um, it's been, populism is somewhat less successful on the Democratic side, but still there. It's still motivating a number of primary challenges over several cycles. And importantly, populists tend to, like, one of the things that populists do across the ideological spectrum is identify a set of elites that are inherently evil and they're working against the rest of us. On the left side, on the progressive side, it's wealth, right? The elites are the wealthy. They're the billionaires. They're the banks. They're Silicon Valley to some extent. And so as those set of voices have gotten louder, they're increasingly seeing these billionaires as the problem. Whereas populists on the right don't really identify wealth as the problem. In some ways, they see them as their heroes. The problem is people like university professors or Hollywood or the media, cultural elites. So it's interesting that you had some polarization going along those lines. Also, this was reminding me of like, you know, we generally are concerned about, kind of wealthy people operating in the shadows, and we don't exactly know their agenda. Um, and then 2024 comes along, and Elon Musk very openly pours like $250 million to help Donald Trump out. Whether that actually tipped the election, I'm skeptical of, but it was a very obvious thing, and he was, clearly expected something in return out of it. Now, the fact is, just a few months later, he tried to bankroll a state Supreme Court race, and he got him roughly nowhere. But it certainly increases the perception that there's something going on here. I'm curious what you see as the cause of this rightward tilt by the, I guess, the tech billionaires. And I know to some of it might just be a reaction to the Biden administration trying to regulate Silicon Valley. But maybe there's something deeper going on, more of a, kind of a MAGA identity. Do you get a sense what's going on there?
Yeah, yeah, kind of.
Okay.
I mean, people, the in the Obama years, it wasn't the tech elite that were hyper radicalized. It was the financial elite, and it was because of Obama came in after the financial crisis, and actually like did not do the most radical kind of response
Right.
to that you can imagine, but he did have to, for political reasons, if nothing else, inveigh against what he called them the fat cats, right? Like, I didn't get elected to help some fat cats get a bonus or whatever. And I mean, they got all rip shit about that. And I think it took Obama a little bit by surprise, and he reasoned, and I think this is accurate, that past a certain level of wealth and power, but in this case, wealth, you become surrounded by people who want to help you because they want some of your money, and they are always flattering you and telling you that everything you did in life was perfect, and that's why you reached this like the top of the mountain, and why you have everything that you deserve, right? And so anyone who comes in and says we want to take some of that back for the greater good, like, just either doesn't understand or is attacking you in some way. They're very sensitive about that. And I think that everyone who, not literally everyone, but it's very common for people who become that wealthy to develop that kind of reactionary identity. Like, view things like we should raise the income tax rate from 33 to 37% or whatever as like a huge affront. And so I think that eventually the Silicon Valley elite went from being like earnest Bay Area progressives to like a regular-ish interest group to being these super rich people who had that same kind of sensitivity, right? And then you can kind of burrow in deeper at the like the individual personalities. Like, Elon Musk got very pissed because Joe Biden didn't invite him to an electric vehicle summit at the White House because Tesla isn't unionized and Musk is super anti-union, and that set him off. But it's ultimately about his feelings again, right?
Okay.
And yes, like the Obama and Biden administrations, I think, yeah, mostly just the Biden administration, uh, tried to regulate Silicon Valley. Like, they saw in Trump somebody who would kind of let them run rampant, both culturally, like um, it's sort of chicken or egg thing, but a lot of them glommed on to like the anti-cancel culture, anti-DEI rhetoric of the Republican Party in the late Trump, early Biden years, and also would make sure that their money wasn't taxed away. If anything, he would funnel more money towards them. And so they got on board, and um, the but the way they've done it leaves me wondering how permanent it is, because it was so opportunistic in so many ways, and their companies are so big and have such large user bases that you can imagine that as Trump continues his self-destructive streak. And, he's maybe polling in the mid 30s now, might get down to the low 30s. I mean, he might be ruining his presidency. That they're going to want to detach from him and go back to the Democrats and say, let's put all that behind us. We can start donating to you again. When you come back into power, let's work together collaboratively. We were just like, try to advance our own interests, and it's a new ball game. Yeah, I think you could also see them kind of joining a permanent right wing oligarchy and using their control over government contractors and social media websites and just their money to try to make sure that Republicans never lose. I don't know which path they're going to take. I do strongly suspect that if Democrats try to meet them halfway, as opposed to say, like, the sins you've committed here are unforgivable to us, and that they're going to get, that's the sort of thing that will drive primary challenges. It'll drive leadership challenges, because unlike in the Obama years, I really think that there is a broadly shared sense in the pro democracy movement or the center left of the country, whatever you want to call it, um, that these titans are part of essentially like a plot against America that succeeded in some sense, and it was a plot at our expense, and there can't be sweeping it under the rug. They view the sort of things that I'm talking about, a confiscatory tax rate on billionaires, as equally important as putting people who committed crimes in prison, et cetera, or as reestablishing the Voting Rights Act, things of that scale. But yeah, that's sort of how I see the evolution of the Silicon Valley billionaire class into this like very weird right wing oligarchy away from Democrats, and like how things might evolve going forward. I Very shortly after the election, I think it might have still been in November, I wrote a piece for Off Message called something like "The Next Gilded Age Will Be Streamed," and the idea was basically like, we've just had this election that was uh, the top of the Republican ticket lies all the time, and everything he said to pander to voters was basically bullshit. And the Republican agenda is going to be to cut taxes and partially pay for it by taking people's health care. But the guy who won happens to be a billionaire in his own right who loves to be feted, and he loves adulation. And he has this golf resort, beachside resort in Palm Beach, where he loves to throw these fancy parties. And he's got this new class of extremely rich hangers on. And a lot of post election politics were going to be people waking up to what was really going on, because they're going to look at their phones, and instead of seeing Donald Trump at, a rally or at a UFC event, they're going to see him at Mar-a-Lago partying with people in tuxedos and ball gowns, being served endless shrimp, and they're going to be losing their health care, and other people are going to be getting tax cuts. And it's going to create a sort of class-based backlash to what he's doing. And the pieces held up pretty well, except that they went way further down that Gilded Age path than I couldn't have imagined he would just bulldoze the White House to build himself a ballroom, and that he would
Right?
take
Yeah.
their money supposedly to help build the ballroom so that
Yeah.
they could all trade favors with each other in the ballroom. But I do think that has had a radicalizing effect on the Democratic primary electorate, and that it's going to be very hard for people like Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer to say, "Hey, part of getting the Democratic Party back on an even keel is making peace with Palantir and SpaceX," and you know what I mean.
Yeah.
People are going to want to hear, "We're going to take Palantir and SpaceX out of the
Yeah.
hands of the right wing oligarchs who own them, and we're either going to discard them or put them under sensible management." Um, Something to that effect.
Wow. Yeah. Uh, I am sympathetic to the temptation as well.
Wouldn't it be
Um,
nice?
yeah. So on the economy, I had another question for you, and then I will cede the floor. But I wanted to ask you. This is something that you've written about a bit. This aspect of the economy that has frustrated political observers for a while now. The idea that People seem to believe that this is the worst economy ever, and have largely felt this way for several years. The data don't really back that up, at least the data we've traditionally used. I was actually chatting the other day with G. Elliott Morris about this, who's talked about